February 17, 1943. RAF Wick, Northern Scotland. Dawn rises pale over a frozen runway, the kind of morning where even the fuel lines shiver. A de Havilland Mosquito PRMK-4, painted a dull, non-reflective blue, sits motionless against the wind. Its twin Merlin engines glisten with frost. Inside the narrow cockpit, Flight Lieutenant David Colley, 26 years old, adjusts his oxygen mask. Beside him, Sergeant Peter Harker, the navigator and camera operator, runs one last check over the automatic Leica film unit. Their orders are brief but brutal. Photograph German fleet anchorages between Narvik and Tromsø. Confirm Tirpitz's position. Return immediately. No guns. No escorts. Just cameras, fuel and courage. By 6:45 hours, the Mosquito's engines roar to life, smooth, confident, then angry as they spool to full throttle. Snow swirls across the field. The aircraft lifts into the gray air and heads north, out over the North Sea. From this moment, they are entirely alone. The mission's code word, Operation Snowdrop. The air temperature at 30,000 feet, minus 42 degrees Celsius. Frost creeps over the windscreen, and the oxygen mask burns the skin with every breath. The Mosquito climbs fast, running silent, the only sound a faint hum of the engine and the metallic whine of the camera motor behind them. They fly over the Norwegian coast by mid-morning, a landscape carved from ice and shadow. Fjords stretch like veins through white mountains. Below them, German radar stations blink in rhythm, and the black silhouettes of destroyers hug the fjord walls. Colley lowers the nose, lining up the first target. Through the camera window, Harker sees it, a massive battleship shape beneath camouflage netting. The Tirpitz, Hitler's fortress of the north, hiding in the Kofjord under layers of winter mist. He adjusts the focus, shivering. Each exposure click is another heartbeat. 1/500th of a second per frame, 5 photographs every 2 seconds. The images will tell the Admiralty whether the Tirpitz is fueling, whether her escorts are ready, whether she can sail to strike the next Arctic convoy. Every picture is a possible turning point. For 40 minutes, they circle under intermittent cloud cover, dodging anti-aircraft fire from the shore batteries near Altifjord. Shell bursts flash far below, silent fireworks against the snow. Colley banks sharply south. Film complete, Harker confirms. They turn for home, flying into cloud and dusk. Then, without warning, the temperature drops again. The fuel mixture begins to crystallize. Needles twitch on the dials. The engines cough once, then twice. We're icing up. Colley shouts. He switches to de-icing system. Nothing. The control stick stiffens. The aircraft trembles. The altimeter drops. 14,000 feet, 12,000, 9,000. The North Sea is somewhere below, invisible. The horizon disappears into white. They clear the last of the fjords trying to gain altitude, but the Mosquito lurches. One engine flames out. Then the second sputters. Silence. The aircraft drifts down like a falling leaf through the Arctic air, the cockpit shaking violently. Harker grips the film canister strapped to his chest. He looks at Colley, eyes steady, face pale beneath frost. We can't lose it, he says. Not after all this. Colley nods. Hold on. They hit the ice at 140 miles per hour. The sound is like thunder splitting the earth, metal tearing, glass shattering, snow exploding around them. Then nothing. White silence. No movement. Only wind moving across the wreckage. A broken aircraft half buried in the snow, somewhere north of Tromsø. Hours pass before either man stirs. Colley crawls free, his hand bleeding, his face torn open by ice shards. He calls for Harker. No answer. Then faintly a voice. Still here? The camera. The Mosquito lies torn apart on the tundra, a trail of film cartridges scattered across the snow. The radio is dead. The compass destroyed. They are 300 miles from help, deep inside enemy-held territory, 2 men, 1 mission, and a single canister of film that could change the course of the Arctic War. For 7 days in temperatures below minus 30 degrees Celsius, they would fight the cold, the wilderness, and despair, all to keep a photograph from freezing with them. 2 weeks earlier. Southern England, late January 1943. At RAF Benson, headquarters of the Photographic Reconnaissance Unit, the war looks different. No bombers. No guns. Just quiet men and their cameras, the eyes of the Allied war machine. Inside a converted manor house turned intelligence office, the walls are covered with maps and aerial photos, grainy black and white images of ships, airfields, and coastal fortifications. Each photo is a fragment of truth, stitched together to reveal the enemy's intentions. Flight Lieutenant David Colley studies one photograph in silence. The image shows a Norwegian fjord lined with ice, a faint dark line cutting across the water. He knows what it means, a ship, maybe the ship. The Tirpitz, Britain's nightmare. The largest battleship Germany ever built, a floating fortress of steel that could destroy an entire convoy alone. Its mere presence in Norway forces the Allies to reroute every Arctic supply line to the Soviet Union. If they can confirm where it hides, if they can prove it's seaworthy, Bomber Command can strike. That single photograph could save thousands of lives. The camera used for the mission sits on a table nearby, an F-24 aerial reconnaissance camera, built by Williamson Manufacturing, designed for high-altitude photography. Its lens is flawless, its shutter precise. It weighs nearly as much as a rifle. Colley and his navigator, Sergeant Peter Harker, have flown dozens of these missions together. Unarmed, unescorted, unseen. Their unofficial motto. Alone, unarmed, unafraid. They know how fragile these flights are. A single burst of flak, a patch of ice, or a fuel miscalculation, and they vanish without a trace. No fanfare. No headlines. Yet every week, men like them climb into their aircraft at dawn and disappear into cloud and silence. For them, the war is not about glory. It's about information. The kind that can only be earned by risking everything. At the operations briefing that morning, the commander of the PRU, Group Captain Alan Hartz, points to a map pinned to the board. Red pins mark recent U-boat sightings along the Norwegian coast. A blue circle is drawn around the Kofjord, Tirpitz's suspected anchorage. Hartz says quietly, "We've had no eyes on the fjord for 30 days. The ice cover makes satellite photographs useless. The Admiralty needs confirmation, and soon." He looks at Colley. "You're up for Snowdrop." Colley nods once. He doesn't ask what happens if he doesn't come back. He already knows. Later that night, in the small base canteen, he and Harker share coffee that's gone cold. They talk little. There's nothing to say that hasn't been said before. Harker finally breaks the silence. "It's strange, isn't it? Flying that far north just to bring back something no one will ever see." Colley looks down at his cup. "Someone will see it. Someone who will use it to end this." The next morning, mechanics refuel the Mosquito under a rising gray sky. The ground crew scrape frost from the propellers with gloved hands. Harker checks the camera bay, locking in the film cartridge marked A2, Norway, Kofjord Sector. The film itself is nothing special, a 100-foot roll of Kodak Type 340. Yet on it will rest the fate of 100 Allied ships steaming toward Murmansk. When they taxi out onto the runway, the wind cuts across the field like knives. Colley looks down once at his mission logbook, where he's written 3 words: "If we don't return, then nothing else." The Mosquito takes off, rising into the blinding winter sky. The camera begins to hum softly in its bay, counting the seconds until exposure. Somewhere below, mechanics watch the tiny blue aircraft vanish into the clouds, one of hundreds that will never return. Back in London, at the Air Ministry, intelligence officers study previous photographs pinned to a corkboard. All are unclear, streaked with snow glare. None show the Tirpitz. A major size. We need one clear shot. Just one. The war has become a battle of visibility, who can see the other first. And on that morning, high above Norway, Colley and Harker carry that burden alone. They don't know yet that the cold waiting over the Barents Sea will become their enemy. They don't know that their names will vanish from the records for 80 years. All they know is the mission, and the photograph that might change everything. As they crossed into Arctic airspace, frost crept along the wings, and the first hint of disaster shimmered like glass in the cockpit window. February 17, 1943. 0900 hours. Altitude 29,000 feet. Position, crossing the Norwegian coast north of Narvik. Below them, the world turns white. Mountains drowning in mist, fjords locked under ice. The Mosquito hums through the still air, its engines vibrating the fuselage like the pulse of a heartbeat. Flight Lieutenant Colley stares ahead, eyes burning from the oxygen mask. Each breath feels like fire and ice at once. The cabin temperature has dropped to minus 35 degrees Celsius. Frost creeps across the inside of the canopy, tracing veins of crystal light. Sergeant Harker checks his instruments. The needles quiver in the cold. He reaches down to adjust the F-24 camera, its lens frosting over even in the heated bay. He knows what's below them, the German battleship Tirpitz, invisible to radar, hidden under camouflage nets in Kofjord. He has 40 minutes of daylight left to find it. Through the narrow window, the sunlight flickers. Gold for an instant, then gray again. The horizon blurs. The altimeter drops slightly. Kali taps it with his gloved finger. "We're fine," he mutters. "Just turbulence." But he knows better. The Arctic doesn't forgive mistakes. At 29,000 feet, the moisture in the air begins to crystallize around the wings. At first it's delicate, a thin, glittering lace. Then, suddenly, it spreads like frostbite. Tiny ice needles bite into the propeller edges. The starboard engine coughs once, then steadies. Kali switches the de-icing control to on. A low whine fills the cockpit, but the ice doesn't melt. The temperature is too low. They push northward into the storm's edge. The visibility drops to nothing. The sun disappears. It's as though the sky itself has turned solid. Static crackles through the radio. The voice of ground control fades in, faint and broken. "Red leader, do you copy? Altitude, icing layer?" Then silence. Harker looks at Kali. "We've lost signal." "Keep scanning," Kali says. "We're almost on target." Below, the fjord opens briefly through the clouds, a black ribbon in a sea of white. Harker presses the shutter. Click, click, click. Each exposure slices through the storm, recording fragments of the invisible enemy. Destroyers docked under nets. Oil slicks on frozen water. A faint shadow, the Tirpitz herself. "Got it," Harker whispers. They bank hard south away from the coast. That's when the second engine begins to sputter. The frost has spread across the air intakes. Fuel pressure drops to zero. Kali adjusts the mixture. No response. Starboard's losing power. "Port's following," Harker says, his voice tight. The aircraft shakes violently. Ice cracks off the wings and sheets. Warning lights flicker across the instrument panel. Kali throttles down, fighting for control. The nose begins to dip, slowly then sharply. "We're going down." He levels the wings and looks through the windshield. Nothing but blinding white. No horizon. No sense of up or down. The Arctic has swallowed them whole. The altimeter spins, 10,000 feet. 9,000. 7,000. Kali's knuckles turn white on the control column. Harker grabs the camera, holding it close to his chest. "We can't lose the film," he says. "Forget the film." Kali shouts. "Get ready." The Mosquito drops through cloud and bursts into a snowstorm. Ice fragments hammer the fuselage like bullets. The engines wheeze and die. For a moment there is silence, the kind that exists before impact. Then a sound like tearing metal fills the air. The Mosquito hits the tundra, bounces once and skids through a ridge of snow. Everything goes black. When Kali opens his eyes, the cockpit canopy is shattered. Snow drifts across the controls. His gloves are gone. His hand bleeds freely, the skin already blistering with frostbite. Harker. No response. He pushes himself out through the cracked glass, the wind screaming around him. The wreckage steams faintly in the freezing air. Then a cough. Harker is alive, trapped in the navigator's seat, half buried in snow. Kali pulls him free, his muscles shaking with cold. Harker clutches the camera to his chest, his voice barely audible. The film's intact. Kali looks around. The sky is gray, endless. No trees. No sound. Just an expanse of white stretching to the horizon. The compass is destroyed. The radio is dead. The nearest Allied line is more than 300 miles away. He looks back at the wrecked Mosquito, the twisted metal, the engine still ticking softly as it cools. The wind howls across the tundra. They are alone. No one knows they're here. And no one is coming. That night, the temperature would drop to -40. Their rations would freeze solid. And yet, in the middle of that Arctic silence, the war, their war, was only beginning. When the Mosquito finally stopped moving, there was no sound left, only the wind. No flames. No smoke. Just the frozen breath of the Arctic swallowing everything. The aircraft lay broken across the snow, one wing torn off, the nose buried deep in ice. Kali crawled through what had once been the cockpit. His ears rang. His vision blurred. Every breath burned his lungs like glass. Harker. He heard nothing at first, then, a faint voice half buried in snow. "Here?" Harker lay near the tail section, his leg twisted, his flight gear torn. The camera harness was still strapped across his chest, covered in frost. Kali dragged him free, fighting the wind that screamed like a living thing. Together, they stumbled toward a small hollow beside the wreckage. The air smelled of oil, metal, and cold, that particular emptiness that exists only where nothing lives. The temperature was dropping fast, -30 degrees Celsius and falling. Kali ripped fabric from the parachutes, wrapping it around Harker's shoulders. Then he tore open the emergency kit. 2 chocolate bars, a flare pistol, a compass, shattered. No radio. No stove. The nearest known Allied station was across the border in Sweden, nearly 300 miles away. They were stranded. For a moment, Kali looked up at the sky, flat gray, no stars. The silence was so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. He turned back toward the wreck. One of the engines still ticked softly as it cooled. He knew the sound wouldn't last long. Soon the cold would take that too. Inside the fuselage, he found the camera bay half buried under snow. The frame had snapped clean in two, but the film canister, the small aluminum tube that held the mission's entire purpose, had survived. He wiped frost off the casing. His gloved fingers stuck to the metal. Then he said quietly, "We keep this safe, no matter what happens." Harker nodded weakly. His face was pale and blistered. They gathered what wreckage they could and built a crude shelter against the wind. Torn aluminum panels, seat cushions, parachute silk. The Arctic twilight bled into darkness. By 1600 hours, night had fallen. The wind howled at 50 knots. They huddled close, breathing through layers of frozen cloth. The temperature fell below -40. Their watches had stopped working. Time had lost meaning. At some point in the night, Kali thought he heard movement, a soft crunching outside. He pushed aside a flap of parachute fabric and stared into the white darkness. Shapes moved in the distance, low, silent, shifting through the snow. Wolves. He reached for the flare pistol, his hands trembling so badly he almost dropped it. A single red flare burst into the sky, hissing and crackling. The wolves scattered. The light painted the wreckage blood red for a few seconds, then faded. Silence again. Harker's breathing was shallow. Frostbite had already blackened his fingertips. Kali held his own hands under his armpits, trying to keep the blood moving. He thought of home, of the green hills outside Oxfordshire, of the warmth of tea in a real cup, and then of the photograph. He could see it in his mind, the dark shadow of the tirpitz beneath the nets, the oil slick on the water. He whispered to himself, "We got her. We found her." But the Arctic didn't care about photographs or wars. It cared only for cold. The sound of the wind deepened until it became almost like a voice, steady, ancient, endless. Each hour that passed was a victory in itself. When dawn came, it brought no light, only a gray glow over the endless plain. The wreckage looked smaller now, half buried by drifted snow. Kali forced himself up. His legs were stiff, his boots frozen solid. He walked a few yards from the shelter, scanning the horizon. Nothing. No smoke. No movement. No sky trail. He turned back to Harker, who was awake now, his lips cracked and bleeding. "We're alive," Kali said. "For now," Harker answered. They both smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes from stubbornness, not hope. That day they melted snow in a metal cup over burning fabric. The smoke stung their eyes. They ate half a chocolate bar each. When Kali tried to sleep, he dreamt of engines still running, of the hum that had once meant life. But the only sound now was the wind. And somewhere in the wreck, wrapped in parachute silk, the film lay safe, the one piece of proof that their suffering still meant something. By the second night, frostbite would take their hands, hunger would take their strength, but the cold would not take the film. Not yet. By the third day, the Arctic had begun to erase them. The wreck was half buried in snow. The aluminum skin had turned white with frost. Even the parachutes they used as blankets had frozen stiff like sheets of glass. Kali's hands no longer felt pain, only a deep, dull pressure when he tried to move them. Harker's face had blistered black from windburn. He could barely open one eye. They rationed the last of the chocolate into crumbs and melted snow for water. Every swallow felt like swallowing knives. And still, the camera lay between them, wrapped in a torn parachute, its lens fogged but unbroken. The wind never stopped. It howled across the tundra like the sea, a sound that became almost human after a while, as if mocking them. In the pauses between gusts, they could hear the crack of ice shifting in the distance, the groan of the earth itself. Sometimes at night, Kali thought he heard engines. He'd crawl out of the shelter, scanning the horizon for lights. Nothing. Only the faint shimmer of the aurora, dancing mockingly over a frozen wasteland that offered no rescue. The human mind begins to drift in that kind of isolation. Time folds in on itself. You stop thinking in hours or days. You think only in moments. Stay awake, melt snow, breathe. On the morning of the fourth day, Harker couldn't move his fingers anymore. He looked at them, swollen, black at the tips, and said quietly, "I won't make it another night." Kali forced a smile. "Then I'll carry you." Harker laughed, A dry, broken sound. And the film? Kali looked at the wrapped canister between them. That goes too. There was silence for a long time after that. The kind of silence that feels final. At midday the storm hit. A wall of snow rolled across the plain, swallowing sky and ground alike. They sealed themselves inside the wreckage, the parachute fabric whipping like sails in the wind. The air grew thick with frost and smoke from their makeshift fire. Insulation torn from the cockpit, burning slow and toxic. It stung their eyes, filled their lungs, but gave them heat. Through the haze, Harker spoke again. You ever wonder if anyone will find this? Kali didn't answer. He looked at the camera, that small, meaningless object in a place where nothing else survived, and felt a strange anger. So much risk, so much death, all for something invisible. A strip of negatives. A shadow on film. And yet, without it, no one would know the Tirpitz was ready to strike. The convoys to Russia would keep sailing blind into danger. Hundreds of men would die. That thought kept him awake through the storm. By nightfall, Harker began to drift in and out of delirium. He muttered about home, about the smell of rain on pavement, about his wife's hair. Then he grew quiet. Kali checked his pulse. Faint but still there. He fed the last of the parachute cloth into the fire. The flames turned blue for a moment, then died. Outside, the aurora flickered again, painting green light over the snow. Kali stared at it through the gap in the wreckage, a ghostly reminder that the world was still moving even if they were not. He pressed his frostbitten hand to the camera casing and whispered, "Hold on. Just hold on." When morning came, there was no color left in the world. Only white, gray, and silence. The wind had stopped. Kali stepped outside for the first time in a full day. The air was so cold it burned his lungs. He turned in a full circle. Nothing. He shouted once just to hear a voice again. The sound vanished instantly into the distance. He went back inside, sat beside Harker, and began writing in the back of his mission logbook with a pencil so frozen it barely left a mark. Day 5. Engines silent. Food gone. Harker weak. Film intact. Mission objective unchanged. Awaiting anything. He looked up from the page and laughed once, softly, not from humor but defiance. Then he tucked the logbook beside the camera and held his hand over Harker's shoulder. "You're not dying here," he whispered. "Not before I do." And in that moment, that tiny, impossible moment of warmth in a world made of ice, the story of their survival became more than endurance. It became faith. Faith that somewhere, someone would see what they'd risked everything to capture. On the 6th day, faint tracks appeared on the horizon, ski prints moving toward them. Rescue or enemy they couldn't yet tell. But either way, their story was about to end, or begin again. Day 6. The Arctic had grown eerily quiet. The wind, constant for nearly a week, finally fell away, leaving an empty silence that felt almost wrong. Kali woke first. He couldn't feel his feet. His breath came out in slow clouds that froze on his scarf. Harker lay beside him, still breathing but shallowly, his face now gray-white, almost the same color as the snow. Then Kali saw it, faint across the horizon. Lines in the snow. Not wind-carved. Not animal. Tracks. He blinked twice to be sure. They were real. Parallel grooves running in a long curve across the plain. Ski tracks. He crawled outside, clutching the flare pistol with frozen fingers. For a moment he wanted to fire, to signal, but something in him hesitated. If those were German patrols, firing a flare would be suicide. Norway was still occupied. Enemy mountain troops often scouted deep inland for downed aircraft. He looked back at Harker, then at the sky, gray, dim, infinite. Hope had a cost here. He spent the next hour watching the horizon. The tracks moved closer. Then, a flicker of movement. Figures. Skiers. 3 of them, dark shapes gliding soundlessly across the snow. Kali crouched low, gripping the flare gun. The figures stopped near the wreck. One raised a hand, not in threat but a wave. He still didn't fire. He waited. Then one of them lifted a flag, red cross on white background. Relief hit him like a blow. He fired the flare. The red light burst in the air, hissing, the only color in a world of white. The skiers quickened their pace. An hour later, Kali sat half-conscious, wrapped in wool blankets. The rescuers, Norwegian resistance fighters, spoke little English but enough to make things clear. British? RAF. Yes. Reconnaissance. Shot down 6 days ago. They nodded gravely. One of them, older, wearing a fur cap, touched the broken mosquito with a kind of respect. "You are lucky men," he said. Harker was lifted carefully onto a sled. He opened his eyes only once, whispering, "The film?" Kali pointed to the small metal canister still tucked inside his jacket. Safe. The Norwegians exchanged a look. They seemed to know what that meant. The journey south was agony. They moved through valleys and ridges, over frozen rivers that cracked under their skis. Kali drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he saw things, flashes of warmth, London streets, the sound of engines. Other times he saw nothing but white. Each night, they stopped in caves or shepherd huts abandoned since the invasion. They shared black bread and melted snow. The Norwegians prayed quietly before eating. By the 7th day they reached a fishing village hidden along the fjord. A British submarine waited offshore. It had been sent weeks earlier to extract agents. No one expected to find 2 half-dead airmen instead. When Kali was carried aboard, he tried to stand, insisting on one thing only. The film, give it to the captain. The submarine commander, a young officer from Devon, took it with a puzzled look. You're sure this is what you risked your lives for? Kali nodded. You'll understand when you see it. Back in Britain weeks later, when the negatives were finally developed, intelligence officers stared in stunned silence. There it was, Tirpitz. Clear, sharp, undeniable. Moored and armed, hidden under camouflage, ready to strike Allied convoys bound for Murmansk. The photographs changed the course of operations in the North Atlantic. RAF Bomber Command began planning new raids within days. The Arctic had not been endured in vain. Kali and Harker survived. Barely. Both men were hospitalized for months, their hands and feet bandaged beyond recognition. But when the Air Ministry sent for them, the message was simple. You brought back the most valuable photograph of the year. Kali smiled weakly. Then it was worth it. The war would move on. The Tirpitz would fall a year later. But the story of 2 men in the Arctic, who froze, starved, and nearly died for a single photograph, would fade into silence. Until now. When the photographs finally reached London, the war room fell silent. Spread across the table were a series of grainy black and white images, streaks of white snow, fractured fjords, the glint of frozen steel. And in the center of one frame, the unmistakable outline of a warship the Allies had spent 2 years hunting. The Tirpitz. 4 months she had been a phantom, Hitler's pride, a 42,000-ton floating fortress that lurked in Norway's fjords, threatening every Arctic convoy to Russia. She never had to move to terrify. Her mere existence forced the Royal Navy to guard entire ocean routes, draining fuel, ships, and men. Now, thanks to 2 half-dead airmen, the Phantom had a face. The photographs were clear enough to read the camouflage nets, to count the gun turrets, to identify where she'd refueled. And from that information a plan was born, Operation Tungsten. In April 1944, nearly a year later, 42 Fleet Air Arm aircraft thundered over the Kofjord. They struck at dawn. The Tirpitz took multiple hits, armor-piercing bombs tearing through her deck. Smoke rose thousands of feet into the Arctic sky. She didn't sink that day. But she never sailed again. The raids that followed, Paravane, Obviate, Catechism, would finally finish her. By late 1944, the once mighty battleship lay capsized in the fjord, half submerged, her hull split by the final blow. And it all began with one photograph, taken from a frozen mosquito 29,000 feet above Norway. In the quiet aftermath, Flight Lieutenant Kali and Sergeant Harker were both recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross. But neither of them ever spoke much about the mission. When journalists later asked about the crash, Kali only said, "We did our job. The rest is just weather." Harker lost 3 fingers to frostbite. He returned home to his wife in Yorkshire and never flew again. Yet on his mantelpiece for years stood a framed black and white photo, not of him or Kali but of a gray shape half buried in ice. The Tirpitz, taken through the frost of a camera lens that refused to die. In 1972, long after both men had passed, their names resurfaced in declassified intelligence reports. Historians studying the Arctic campaigns discovered the mission logs, the recovered negatives, and the coded Air Ministry memos. It became clear that one photograph, captured at the edge of human endurance, had directly led to the destruction of Hitler's last great surface ship. The world never knew their faces, but their frozen fingerprints were on the fall of a legend. Even now, decades later, deep in the archives of the Imperial War Museum, the original negative remains, a small, scratched reel of film in a metal canister labeled Recon Flight 210/February 17, 1943, Norway Sector. It's easy to miss. It sits between folders of larger, louder missions, Dam Busters, Berlin Raids, the Normandy Campaign. But if you look closely, you can see the faint signature at the bottom of the report. Lieutenant J. Colley, navigator, Sergeant A. Harker. Two names that history almost forgot, and yet whose single act of endurance shifted the war's balance in the Arctic seas. When historians review the mission today, they often call it the coldest photograph ever taken. But it wasn't just cold, it was costly. Every inch of that frame was paid for in blood, frost, and silence. Two men trapped in a frozen nowhere, fighting not for glory, but for proof that the truth mattered even when no one might live to see it. The next time you see a wartime photograph, black and white, grainy, anonymous, remember this: someone somewhere may have frozen half to death to make sure the world saw it. For nearly 30 years, the story of the Arctic crash vanished from public record. The official report filed by RAF Coastal Command simply read, "Aircraft missing, presumed lost on reconnaissance north of Norway." No mention of the crash. No mention of the survival. No mention of the photograph that changed the war. Colley returned to a quiet life in the English countryside. He rarely spoke of the mission, not even to his family. When neighbors asked about his time in the RAF, he'd smile faintly and say, "Mostly weather reports." Harker, living in Yorkshire, became a schoolteacher. Every Remembrance Day, he'd pause a moment longer during the silence, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He never said why. But sometimes, in the stillness, he'd trace the shape of a camera lens with his thumb. Then, in the early 1970s, a box arrived at the Imperial War Museum, contents labeled simply, "Arctic Reconnaissance, Restricted." Inside were faded logbooks, fragments of a flight map, and a small canister of 35mm negatives. A curator held one strip to the light and gasped. The faint shadow of a battleship emerged, massive, unmistakable. The notes attached bore two names, Lieutenant J. Colley and Sergeant A. Harker. Researchers traced the records, cross-referenced mission orders, and realized what they'd found: the lost reconnaissance mission that had led to the first successful strike against Tirpitz. It was a revelation that rewrote a piece of history. What had once been classified as a routine flight was now recognized as one of the most dangerous photographic missions of the war. In 1975, the museum displayed the negatives publicly for the first time. Visitors paused, staring at the grainy black and white image, a shape under snow framed by Arctic mist. Most walked by without knowing the story. But one elderly man, standing quietly in the corner, whispered to his grandson, "I knew the one who took that." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Today, the Arctic region where the Mosquito crashed remains one of the most remote places on Earth. But occasionally, Norwegian hikers still find fragments, twisted aluminum buried deep in ice. A small metal plate stamped 210 SQN was recovered in 2013. It was confirmed to belong to the aircraft Colley and Harker flew that day. The site is now unofficially known among locals as Flyveriasplassin, the aviator's place. A wooden cross stands there, facing north toward the frozen sea. At its base, someone carved a few simple words in both English and Norwegian. For the photograph that changed the war. Every year, a small number of visitors leave flowers. Others leave photographs, not of ships or planes but of faces. Young pilots, lost brothers, unknown heroes. Because that's what this story became, not just about a photograph but about endurance, duty, and the quiet bravery of men history almost forgot. 70 years later, the Arctic sky looks almost the same, endless white, unbroken silence, cold that still burns like truth. But above it now, instead of Mosquito aircraft, satellites orbit quietly. Cameras thousands of miles above the Earth capture images sharper than anything Colley or Harker could have imagined. Every single one of those images, every reconnaissance photograph, every satellite feed, every aerial survey, traces its lineage back to the men who once risked their lives for a single shot. The idea that information could win wars was born not in command rooms, but in the freezing air over Norway. Back then, one photograph could redirect fleets, reshape strategy, and save convoys. Today, the same principle guides intelligence from Ukraine to the Pacific. Truth as weapon, vision as power. Modern analysts often talk about real-time visibility, high-resolution targeting, and live mapping. But in 1943, none of that existed. You had film that could freeze, lenses that could fog, engines that could die, and men who had to fly into the unknown anyway. Colley and Harker didn't have satellites or drones or radar imaging. They had courage, frostbite, and the unshakable belief that what they saw, if they could just bring it home, would matter. Today, historians studying early reconnaissance call their mission one of the purest acts of information warfare in history. Not a shot fired, not a bomb dropped, yet it shifted a front, crippled a navy, and changed the enemy's mind. That's what intelligence does when done right. It changes the mind before it changes the battlefield. And in a world where technology now makes it instant, Kali and Harker's story reminds us of the human price behind that clarity. When you see satellite imagery today, of a war zone, a city after an earthquake, or the clouds above the pole, remember that it all began with film that froze solid in the Arctic night. And with 2 airmen who refused to die before they'd finished their photograph. In 2018, a research team from the University of Tromsø retraced their flight path using modern mapping tools. They found fragments of wreckage still visible through ice melt on satellite photos. Among them, a bent propeller blade, the remnants of a wooden wing spar, both preserved in frost for over 70 years. When those images were overlaid with Kali's 1943 flight logs, the coordinates matched almost perfectly. The Arctic had never forgotten them, it had just kept their story frozen until the world was ready to see it again. When the war ended, the world celebrated the great victories, D-Day, Normandy, Berlin. But some victories were silent. They came from frozen hands holding a camera steady, from a pilot refusing to let go of hope, and from a picture that outlived them both. History remembers the loud moments. But it was the quiet ones, the unseen, the unspoken, that truly shaped the war. If you've watched this far, you already carry their story. So honor their courage, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel because every week we uncover another untold story that history almost buried. The kind of story men like Kali and Harker froze to keep alive. And remember, sometimes one forgotten photograph can change everything.